Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Lauren Richmond Jr. welcomes Chuck DeGroat to the program. Chuck is a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, where he also serves as the founding executive director of the Clinical Mental Health Counseling Program. He is a licensed therapist, spiritual director, author, retreat leader, speaker, and faculty member with the Soul Care Institute. As a therapist, he specializes in navigating issues of abuse and trauma, pastoral and leadership health, and doubt and dark nights on the faith journey. He trains clergy in handling issues of abuse and trauma, conducts pastor and planter assessments, and facilitates church consultations and investigations of abuse. Before transitioning to training and forming pastors, Chuck served as a pastor in Orlando and San Francisco. He and his wife Sarah have been married for 30 years and have 2 adult daughters. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Lauren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at lauren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
Okay, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr., and today I'm pleased to be welcoming Chuck DeGroat. And I'm sorry, Chuck, did you want like titles or?
No, no, Chuck is great.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. You've been on the show before, but just share, if you would, briefly just about your background and what's going on with you today.
Yeah, I was in I'm originally from Long Island, New York, by way of Iowa, Chicago, Florida, San Francisco, and now West Michigan. I was a pastor in Orlando and in San Francisco and started some clinical counseling centers in those places. And then I've been a faculty member at a seminary in West Michigan, Western Theological Seminary, for the last 11 years, where I lead a clinical counseling program here. And so, yeah, it's been a pretty full life. And I'm a therapist. I'm a pastor as well as a therapist. So I've been practicing as a therapist for 25 years as well.
Yeah, awesome. And then you're good at this, and I could probably use some of this later on after we wrap. Some spiritual practices that you like to do or find meaningful.
Well, I think at the top of the list is contemplative prayer, silent prayer.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a tradition where prayer was wrapped around a lot of words.
Yeah.
And so, for me now, silence, a more imaginative space that I go into, those are important practices. Breathing, connecting to my body. So very embodied contemplative prayer practice is kind of right at the top of my list. But I love engaging nature, walks in nature, walking labyrinths.
Yeah.
And things like that too.
Yeah. Awesome for sharing. Thank you for sharing that. Well, we're kind of jumping right into it because Chuck has a heart out and a lot of content actually to talk about in his book. Chuck's the author of the book, Healing What's Within. You'll have to give the subtitle, but when does this book come out, Chuck, as we're recording this?
October 8th of 24.
Okay. So I can't remember when this is scheduled there, but so be on the lookout. I'm sure it'll be available for pre-order regardless, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So whether it's pre-October or post-October, be on the lookout for it. But I think so. And I had the privilege, Chuck, to hear you when you spoke at Steve Cuss's conference. I think that was like a year ago.
Yeah, that's right.
In the Denver Metro, and you touched on some of these themes. But talk a little bit about, like, I hate to say what inspired the book, but really like how this coalesced into a book.
Yeah. Well, I had done some work before this on narcissism in the church, and that conversation, there's a lot that goes into that. Narcissism and spiritual abuse in the church is pretty fraught territory, and you encounter people in a lot of pain. And I had my own experience many years ago too. And so as I thought about what might be next, I really wanted to focus on the healing process.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to do like a narcissism book 2.0 or something like that. But, now when we experience things that are hard and that we can't really control, like events that happen to us, maybe a desire for justice that we just can't get. Like, so what do we do then? And how do we do the healing work within? Mm-hmm. One of the things we know about trauma is that trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens within.
Yeah.
The imprint that's left behind. And so this is really a book that invites people to do that deep inner work, but also framed up through 3 questions from Genesis chapter 3. So I really wanted to also invite people to hear God's curious and compassionate questions with a different ear than they might have heard them with before. Perhaps if they'd grown up in traditions where God was particularly angry in Genesis chapter 3. And so I really wanted to sort of frame those in a compassionate way to say, in the midst of your pain, your trauma, experiences of injustice, abuse, God shows up with kindness and compassion.
Why don't you share a little bit about, internal family systems theory? Because I think that certainly has a key role, that concept or framework within the book. Why don't you explain that a little bit for our listeners? We might reference
Yeah, there's one particular chapter. I think it's like chapter 6, 5. I can't remember.
Yeah.
Where in fact, I even start out with the movie Inside Out, the first one. I don't think when I submitted my manuscript, I knew a second one was coming out. But I found internal family systems 20 years ago now on a VHS tape at a school where I was doing some teaching, and it blew my mind because the real simple way of talking about it is we all have parts, which is to say, we wake up in the morning and part of us wants to lay in bed, and another part wants to get going, and another part says, I'm not even sure I want to be in this world anymore. And we're complex, we're multifaceted, and I think the reality is because of the pain of our lives, the experiences that we've had, there are different parts of us that show up in different ways at different times. And, there's probably a version of me that shows up to something like this that wants to do well, wants Lauren to appreciate, how articulate. See, I can't even say the word I am, and how much I have to offer.
Yeah.
And other parts of me that might be sort of hiding in the background that carry shame or anxiety and we all live like this. We end up living pretty divided lives. And the work of internal family systems is really about being deeply connected to our true selves, and living from that core and anchored place, while continuing to have access to these other different parts of us that tend to go off on their own, but really need a lot of love and care in the process. And so, part of what I introduced folks to in this is a bit of that work of befriending the different parts of us that sometimes take over, sometimes are perfectionistic, sometimes are angry, sometimes are ashamed, and with a lot of kindness and hospitality within.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm just thinking again, like, I think I said this in my email to you, that this is in many ways like a book that I read that I found so helpful for me. And that's why I wanted to talk to you. And I'm hoping it's helpful for our listeners as well. But I'm just thinking about like the parts, like I was at a church group and I've been really trying to do some like parts work myself. And I was in a group where I felt like I was I'm trying to be aware of like, again, how my parts show up. So like in this group, like I felt like, oh, I'm talking too much and that part is being too much. And then I talked to my wife and she's like, hey, you didn't say enough. So it's just being aware of those parts, right? Is a learning endeavor.
Yeah, it is. And, I think this is part of growing in self-awareness, that as you become more aware of how you show up in different times and different places, like someone reflected back to me recently that they sensed that I was a bit anxious and that I was coming off as like the funny guy. I was trying to be the funny guy. And I thought, oh, that's a really old story in my body. Like that was one of the ways that I used to cope growing up on Long Island, New York, where I grew up in the midst of the anxiety and tumultuousness I grew up in. So I'll keep it light. I'll keep it funny. And so how do I become more aware of that part of me? That's okay to be funny, but I also want to be aware of when it's a way of coping.
Yeah.
Because of stress and anxiety and other things.
So you mentioned the befriending of our parts in the book, befriending our suffering. I think that's been one of the most intriguing aspects of IFS, internal family systems theory, as I've learned it. But I'm thinking about like, I'm not going to say my parts, right? But I'm going to think about my parts. And I think about like, it was a real revelation to me to think about some of these parts that are behaving in ways that are not super helpful for me, right? Moving forward. And then learning like, hey, like those parts can actually like really be helpful, and just about figuring it out. So like, I want to really contextualize this, because again, this is a podcast for pastors and church leaders. So I want to contextualize it to that context and space. And I remember like having this conversation with another guest, but like, I guess I'll speak somewhat generally for myself. Like I can imagine in a church context where I have a part that's, as a pastor, that it's hard to think of that part as helpful when it's constantly behaving in unhelpful ways. Like it's like, oh, the budget is screwed and, everybody hates you or whatever, or, there's a congregant that really brings up some memories of a difficult relationship, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that all we can do is sort of control what's going on in us and be aware of what's going on in us, and if you do have some leadership capacity with others, there's a way that I think if you're doing your own work that you can lean in and begin to invite others to become more aware. But the reality is like when you have a group of people come around a table, well, if my funny guy is showing up and her angry side is showing up and his, quiet, passive side is, it might be a disaster of a meeting. It's always best when we can bring the fullness of ourselves to a meeting. And so learning this, doing this work and learning this language as a kind of shorthand so that we can show up more fully is really important, I think. And the reality is we have lots of different ways of coping. Our parts are really, in many respects, ways of coping in the midst of our anxiety and pain and things like that. And if we can become more aware of not only how we're showing up in the present moment, but what the roots are, like how did that start? That could be really helpful.
Yeah, I did something in CPE where I had a clinical pastoral education for our listeners, where I had to write like a narrative, foundational narrative, something like that. And again, it was something when I thought about that narrative in the context of IFS, like my parts, I was like, holy smokes, like it's all right there. Yeah. And then talking to one of my good friends who is well trained in IFS, like he similarly like has a story that he's kind of recognized that really has those parts playing different roles. So it is, boy, it's powerful.
Yeah.
I don't want to get too far into this to not talk about Genesis 3, those 3 questions. So why don't you just talk through those 3 questions? Because, man, for me, they were so, holy smokes, foundational or impactful.
Yeah, it's a lot of people, I think, experience this as a different way of engaging God or being being engaged by God in Genesis chapter 3. And for me, this goes back a long, long time ago, early 2000s, where I was leading some retreats. And it struck me that God's "Where are you?" was maybe not as angry as I'd heard it before.
Yeah.
Most people know the backstory of Genesis 3. This slithering serpent sort of sidles up to Adam and Eve and says, "Did God really say that you must not eat from the tree?" And really what the serpent is doing is it's causing doubt or questions about God's goodness, about Adam and Eve's enoughness. It's just raising lots of questions.
Mm-hmm.
And Adam and Eve are left with this big question of like, are we gonna have to grasp for that fruit in order to fill ourselves in a way that maybe God hadn't filled us, or to meet needs that maybe God hadn't met? Like, in the midst of that question, are we enough? They go ahead and grasp. And of course, they're awakened to their own nakedness. And they feel exposed. And so they're ashamed and they hide and they sew fig leaves. Most people know that part of the story. It's the next part where God is walking in the cool of the day, which is really interesting because, commentators really wrestle with what's going on there. But the reality is that God was probably walking during the part of the day when the sun had gone down, when it was cooler, probably during the time of the day, at least the way the story goes, that God and Adam and Eve would have taken a walk. I think that's whoever is narrating the story is trying to tell something of a story like that. Like, they were friends in the garden, and now God's walking in the garden. Like, where did you go? I miss you. And that's what struck me as like, God's "Where are you?" In fact, the word "where" is the first word of the book of Lamentations. It's a word of heartbreak. It's like a broken friend. Where are you? I remember I got lost a number of years ago in the woods, and my dad was crying out, "Where are you, son? Where are you?" And so that's so different. Like, if you grew up in a tradition where God was angry and it was like "Where the hell are you? Who told you?" So "Where are you?" is a kind question, and it's a question that invites us to come out of hiding, to become aware of how we're hiding and the fig leaves that we've sown.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about that. The second question, "Who told you?" which gets us to reflect on our stories. Like, how did you get here in the first place? And what story have you been believing about yourself? And then the third question, "Have you eaten from the tree?" which is to say, where have you taken your hunger and thirst? Where have you gone for satisfaction? And my sense is that takes us to the New Testament and the question that Jesus asks more than any other question. And that's, what do you want? What do you long for? And I think God is asking us, what do you long for? Wanting us to get in touch with our deepest desires and deepest longings.
Yeah, it really reminds me of something else you talked about in the book about that. I think you wrote about addiction really being about disconnection.
Yeah.
Which I think is a powerful way to say it. But I was reminded of the "Where are you?" Like, one of my previous guests, Yolanda Solomon, I think she made this exact point that throughout scripture, that question is being asked by God, "Where are you?" And it's such a powerful reframing to think about, not as, like you said, that angry "Where are you?" but, hey, where are you? And I think it does fit with the narrative of scripture when we think about, she referenced another story I hadn't thought about, but certainly the prodigal son is the most obvious one that comes to mind.
Yeah.
I think the "who told you," I feel like that really resonates with the parts, right?
Yeah. Yeah, because I think as you start listening within, you begin to hear some different voices. And I don't know about you, maybe I do. Maybe people who are listening right now are like, he hears voices? Like, why did Lauren invite him on? But I do think that, in any given day, as I'm listening within, there are parts of me that are like, they're out and ahead of me, and they're like, "You've got this. You can do this. You're well prepared. You're going to be fine." There are parts of me that are like, "Oh no, stay home today. This isn't going to go well." This morning I taught a class here at the seminary, and on some material I hadn't taught on in a while. And I even told the class, there's a part of me that comes in kind of excited about today, with a voice of like, "Isn't this wonderful that you get to teach on this?" And then there's another part of me that just wanted to kind of crawl into a hole this morning and not come out. because I have this sense that, I haven't taught on this in a long, long time. And what if what if it doesn't go well? That's my shame sort of catching up with me. And there are lots of other different voices within me at any given time, that can be critical, that can be judgmental of others, that can be grandiose, that can be fearful. And so it's always a fun exercise. I mean, people, as you probably know, are kind of dubious about this until they start practicing it.
Right. It sounds super wonky. Like I was reading, cause what is it? Schwartz's big white cover book. I can't remember the title.
Is that No Bad Parts or something else?
No, I think it was like an introduction. I can't remember.
Yeah.
It's frankly like boring. Like I couldn't make it through. It was so boring. Like I was reading it, like wanting to read like, what's his name? Gosh, who's the family systems rabbi guy that I'm blanking on?
Friedman?
Friedman. Like I was expecting like Friedman level of just like brilliance and, just humor and dry wit and everything. And it wasn't quite that, but I was reading his things about these parts, and like what's coming to mind, Chuck, is like Frank Peretti, like, like these, where there's just this inherent mistrust of just anything that sounds different. And, oh gosh, that might be bad, which I guess is a part, right? We might say almost, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
But I was thinking of, when I'm thinking about parts and who told you, I can't remember if you write about this in the book, but I'm thinking of, and I'm blanking on titles right now. I think, is it Ashley Cook, who co-wrote a book on IFS from a Christian perspective?
Oh, Allison Cook.
Allison Cook, yes.
Yeah.
And they talk about, I can't remember the co-author, but they talk about like the spirit-led self.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit, if you can, just about, I don't know if you use similar phraseology or naming, but how do you know, like what, cause again, just to be transparent, because there was a time for me where I could say like, hey, I don't think that's the voice of truth, but I don't know if I can hear like the voice of truth, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it goes by various names, even in the Bible, Paul talks about the old self and the new self, and in the Christian tradition, it's become the true self. Allison and Kim Miller talk about it as the spirit-led self. However you describe it, what they're saying is this is the core of you. This is the image-bearing core where God dwells. This is you when you're anchored and rooted, in that Ephesians 3 kind of sense. That's your adult self, and that we all have a capacity to connect to our adult selves and live from our adult selves. But the reality is that because of what happens to us and what we experience in life, that we live out of these other selves that are just trying to cope frantically, oftentimes in the world, right? And so maybe it's a perfectionist you, or a critic you, or a workaholic you. Maybe it's a self-sabotaging you, but there's a constellation. I remember when I was doing my IFS work, I started back in 2009, 2010, something like that, with Jay Early out in San Francisco. And I remember calling my wife one day after a session, and I was like, I'm up to 14. But the idea being that, the true self is that anchored self where you are the conductor of the orchestra. You create a place at the table for all the other selves around the self to come and sit and be known and seen. And when we're fragmented, when we're frazzled, when we're overwhelmed, when we're exhausted, it's like some of these other selves get out ahead of us. And, perfectionistic me drives the train, or self-sabotaging me drives the bus, or, and that's what we have to begin to notice is like on any given day, at any given moment, like for me, even before our time, I'm asking myself, where are you, Chuck? Because I want to make sure that I'm here sitting in this chair, and it's not like some performative version of me, or maybe some overwhelmed and ashamed part of me that, that I'm here and I'm present in my body and ready to talk to you.
Yeah. Let's stay on that theme, because I wanted to talk about, I'm going to try to find the quote here on page 80. I thought this was frankly, I mean, again, I grew up very conservative, so I found this almost revelatory. You write that while some might contend that our core problem as humans is that we think too highly of ourselves, you say, I'd argue that most of us live with an underlying sense of worthlessness, alienation, and disillusionment. I mean, again, as someone who grew up very conservative Christian, that quote is shocking almost.
Yeah. Yeah. And what we know is that there are certainly people who think too highly of themselves, but underneath that inevitably is shame.
Yeah.
And we see this play out, this is sort of a psychological truism. I think it's a biblical one too. There are a number of people now who are saying, even before Adam and Eve grasped for the fruit, which, is sometimes theologized as some sort of arrogant decision.
Yeah.
Adam and Eve's pride. What they're wrestling with are these questions that are raised by the serpent. They're being gaslit, by the way. They're being abused, by the serpent, who is raising questions that send them spiraling. Like maybe we're not enough. Maybe we're missing something, which I call shame. And so shame precedes even the grasping of the fruit. And so I think for all of us, and, I've done some significant work on narcissism.
Mm-hmm.
The way we understand that psychologically is that you're not born with narcissism. You don't wake up one day and choose to become a narcissist. It's born out of a way of coping. I'm going to become grandiose.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to become the bully because I experienced abuse, or I was bullied, or I was small, or I was made to feel ashamed. And I never, ever want to feel that again.
Yeah, and that really makes sense again from a part's perspective, right? Because I'm not an expert, but I imagine that narcissistic part is just doing super extra overtime, right?
Yeah, that's it. 100%. And that would be a take on narcissism that very few really get and understand. Like I rarely hear that articulated the way you just articulated that, Lauren, but I'd say it's a really important next step in our understanding of it, because too often when people talk about narcissists, thinking about that beautiful space we call Twitter or X, where we have such healthy conversations all the time, but people will call other people narcissists in a way that they seem to be labeling them and speaking to the very core of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
I've been doing this work for a long time, and I know narcissism is never reflective of the core of who a person is. A person at their core is loved, is an image bearer, is seen and known by God, but the narcissist seems to be driving the bus, and it's loud, and the narcissist is causing a lot of problems, but it's just a part.
Yeah, and I think that gets into something that I found intriguing in the book, in the lecture I heard you give. I mean, there certainly is in some ways, I don't know if you want to dive too deep into this, but there certainly is a theological framework or undergirding that's a little shift away from like this total depravity type mentality towards like at least in my own language, I would say as like a brokenness or a woundedness. I think you used that word, right? Yeah.
I mean, I want to start with original goodness, and I want to say that that's core to who we are, and we are image bearing, which is to say we're made for worth, belonging, and purpose. But the reality is that there is this, I call it a primal wound, instead of original sin, I talk about a primal wound. And the reason I do that is, wound is the trauma. By the way, trauma is the Greek word for wound, right? So when we're talking about trauma, we're talking about a core wound. And when we talk about trauma, we're talking about disconnection at its core. And so really what Genesis 3 is about a primal wound, a primal disconnection, a primal trauma that renders us alienated and estranged from ourselves and from each other and from God. And that's the age-old problem. Now, out of that, when our lives when we're disconnected, when we're estranged, when we're disordered, so to speak, we will do things that harm others and harm ourselves. That's what Christians have classically called sin.
Yeah.
But we've got all of this turned upside down because sometimes we define people by as sinners at the core.
Right.
I think that's a real problem.
Yeah, I'm thinking about PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, right? As I understand trauma. And again, that disconnectedness. And this is what's so interesting about the story in Genesis 3, right? How they are disconnected from God, and how, at least as I understand it, like two people can experience the exact same event,
Mhm.
But if one person has someone with them or shortly thereafter to process with, they may not experience that event as traumatic, right? Whereas the
Yeah.
other person who's alone can often develop that trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. This is where, and I'm sure you all have listeners who are like, oh gosh, they're talking about trauma. Everyone's talking about trauma
Right.
nowadays. It's so overused. It's so misused. And, but what I'd want to say is, yeah, it is when people talk about how traumatic it is to drop their phone in the toilet bowl or something. But trauma at its core is, if it's true that it is about disconnection, as we were just talking about,
Mm-hmm.
then we all live with a kind of primal sense of disconnection. We all experience some sense of being estranged from ourselves. G.K. Chesterton once said, every man has forgotten who he is.
Yeah.
That's estrangement. That's alienation. And so there is that kind of resounding wound that, that sort of leaps off the pages from Genesis 3 on, and you see the implications of it for 1,185 chapters of the Bible until you get to Revelation 21 and 22. And that trauma that you're speaking of, well, there's a lot more that we can say about it, but when two people experience, let's say they go through a natural disaster, a tornado tears through a small town, if a person is taken in by another family, if they're helped, they're fed, they're allowed to cry, the stress that they're experiencing is far less apt to turn into trauma than the person who goes it alone, which is to say that's the story of Genesis 3 as well. When you go it alone, you're more apt to find yourself disconnected and traumatized. And that's what we need to be paying attention to in our lives.
Yeah, so it brings me to a real practical question that's coming to mind when I'm thinking about clergy, church leaders, especially for clergy. And I guess this is what made COVID so hard, right? Is that we were going through this really traumatic event, and broadly speaking, we're very isolated. Like, is this why it's so important for clergy to have some kind of support group or close friendship?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was just on a call the other morning with a group. We're trying to maybe get some money to do some work on secondary trauma for pastors, pastors, who are constantly dealing with all kinds of realities, right? And you got the funerals, you got the disappointed parishioners, and you got the people who are like, we need to sing these songs more. And we got all the stuff that pastors go through. And the language that we use is secondary trauma, which is to say that, as a result of being in the midst of all these crises that go on every day, pastors start to feel numb or angry or cynical or lethargic or overwhelmed or grandiose in the sense that I can do anything. And so that's why it's so important for pastors to have friends, to be connected, because we're more apt to live in the ongoing sort of story of trauma if we're going it alone. But if you have a group of pastors you're meeting with regularly, and you're like, man, this was a doozy of a week. Like I got broadsided by one of my elders, and then I got another call about another leader in the church with a pornography addiction, and then then we found out that we're not going to have enough money to meet budget this year.
Right.
It's like, you need to be processing that.
Yeah. We're kind of ping-ponging back and forth here just because, like, there's so much good stuff you have, and it kind of sparks my mind about something else. I want to go back to, you write about biography never excusing harmful behavior. I want to see if I can find the quote, but it's certainly, let me see if I can find the quote. But it certainly invites us to attend to the wound of which it occurs. So again, this really gets into, I think, a broader theological question of, whether it be total depravity, what have you.
Yeah.
Talk about that, because maybe I'm being too cynical, but it does seem like, from my perspective, there can be this tendency in our culture to be like, oh, we can just, hey, he grew up in a rough home, so, that's why he's doing what he is. Like, we can understand it, but also like, hey, talk about like how to balance that tension between, hey, I had a rough childhood, but also like, I can't just act like a jerk 24/7. Like, I'm thinking, I don't know if you watch The Good Place. Like, I love The Good Place. Like Eleanor Shellstrop, right?
Yeah. part of what you're getting at is, in the last section of the book, I start talking about addiction and how we home in on the behavior. And, what we want to do is we want to change the behavior. We don't want them to drink. We don't want them to look at pornography. We don't want them to overeat. We don't, whatever it is. And, I don't want to minimize the damage that addictive behavior can do, or behavior that's sabotaging of others or harming of others or self, right? I do want to get curious about what it's about.
Yeah.
And, so why is he a jerk, or why does he overdrink, or why does she look at pornography? Why does she overeat? Whatever the things are, right? Invariably these are born out of a wound, a biography, a story. There's a story underneath. That's why I say there's always biography beneath the behavior.
Yeah.
And so what is that story, and how did that, becoming the jerk, becoming the bully narcissist, over drinking, how was that a source of coping? How was that a way of alleviating anxiety, self-soothing? How has that served the person for years and years? And so, I'm always curious. I tell the story in there of, and I've told this story in a variety of ways over the years, of someone in the church who had an affair and was really being beat up by a lot of other people in the church for the affair. And I went and sat down with this person. I simply asked, what were you longing for?
Yeah.
And I wasn't trying to excuse the behavior, but I was trying to get to the heart. Like what was going on? And this person said, my spouse hasn't looked at me for years. Like I haven't felt loved in years. And, I've been alone. I've been isolated. And in this other person, I found someone who saw me. And, that's not an excuse,
right,
again, for the affair, but it does help make sense of it. And it does help us to approach, I do pastoral care and counseling, right? So I want to approach people, in a way that, that moves toward them with empathy, with compassion, that looks beneath the waterline at, how they can heal most deeply.
Yeah. And I heard this in another context, and I'm not going to get it correct exactly, but the scholar was making the point that in tenuous conversations, we can often come first with like conviction and then curiosity.
Yeah.
And he's kind of making the point, like, let's come first with, I think, compassion, civility, and then finally conviction. Like,
yeah,
you're obviously the expert far more than I am, but I can imagine in a conversation like you're referencing, like coming at someone with like, hey, affairs are wrong. Like she knows that, right? A person in that context probably knows that, and it's not going to solve the issue.
No, it's not. And, you probably push the person further away, you know, and if you look at this from a parts perspective, if there's a part of that person who is acting out in one way or another, the only way to win over that part, which is to say the only way to like actually do the work of healing, is to do it with empathy and compassion. If that's a part that was looking for soothing in an affair, I want to get curious about what it needed in that affair, what it needed in that soothing, why it didn't feel, why this part for a long time didn't feel like it was worth it, why it was able to connect, or whatever the case may be, right? There's a whole trail to pursue there. But of course, this is what I do for a living. Like I love to pursue the under the waterline kind of stuff, right? And, there's some pastors going to say, well, no, you just need to discipline that person. Yeah. But I want to say, I think there's probably more going on there.
Well, I guess I'll just speak personally. Like I found even when I'm like curious about a behavior and curious about like, how does it connect to my part? I'm like, oh, it's like, it helps me not do that behavior. Yeah. If I can figure out, at least to some degree, like, what am I, like, to use that third question, like, what do I really long for? What am I needing in this context? And then it's a real mind trip to I think, accept that part that's behaving poorly and then recognize that, that part is really trying to do good for you. And, oh, wait, this part can actually behave in helpful ways for me.
Yeah.
Context.
Yeah. Those our parts are often just really desperate, where Dan Siegel says that there are 4 fundamental needs every human has when they're born: to feel safe, seen, soothed, and secure. And, I think what happens is when we don't experience that, we're going to be chasing after feelings of safety, soothing, security, etc., for the rest of our lives. And so soothe me, affair, job, success, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. For a narcissist scene, right?
Yeah. The more the merrier.
Yeah. Well, let's take a break and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back. Let me ask you one more question before I let you go, because this is the line that I hated the most, I suppose, in a good way. You write that the deepest work often happens when the lights go out. I mean,
yeah,
I've kind of felt that for a while, and I hate that. So maybe give me some good news, I guess. Give our listeners some good news.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think we want to be in control oftentimes of the process, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I hope this comes off as good news, but I mean, this is a real struggle of mine. I turned 54 this year, and I really thought that I would be over. I've struggled with a lot of anxiety my whole life, right? And I thought, and panic attacks, and I really thought by 40 I'd be done with it. By 45 I'd be done with it. By 50, and it's tough sometimes because the reality is we don't have as much control sometimes over these things as we think we do, right? And I've done all the practices. I've done, I've done the therapy and the practices and stuff like that. But I felt at times very much in the dark, like, okay, God, I don't know where you are. I don't know what else to do. And there is something of a surrender that happens in that space, I think. Maybe for some, you double down. I mean, I've certainly had the tendency to want to double down, but I think some sense of like, okay, so this is, I think this is like, okay, so Paul had a thorn. I guess this is something of a thorn, and I don't like it. I think others struggle with other different kinds of things. And I don't talk about this a whole lot, but it's something that I'm learning to befriend at some level as I certainly think my anxiety and my panic has probably led to a greater sense of dependence and limitation and humility to some degree, and wrestling with God. And so, I don't know that that's good news, but I do think it is, it is something that we learn over the years that, we have far less control. There's far more mystery. And we've got to live our lives a whole lot more open-handed than we ordinarily do.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, great conversation. Really appreciate your insights. Really want to recommend the book. Again, the title is Healing What's Within, available in October. So, share anything else you want to share just about the book, how folks can connect with you, all that stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm on a number of social media spaces. I'm just too old to do TikTok at this point, I think. But at Chuck DeGroat, DeGroat, and then chuckdegroat.net is my website. And I teach out at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, if people want to find me there.
All right. Well, again, really appreciate the conversation. Really recommend the book. Thank you so much for your conversation. Always leave folks with a word of peace. So may God's peace be with you.
Thanks, Lauren.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Lauren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.